Miss Flora Rosewood, you have exactly 23 seconds to decide whether you want to save your grandmother's cafe or watch it be demolished tomorrow morning. Flora blinked 3 times in a row, trying to process the words she had just heard. There she was, in the middle of the most intimidating boardroom she had ever set foot in, with its floor-to-ceiling glass walls and a breathtaking view of the entire city. 20 minutes ago, she was serving coffee with milk and sugar bread at Grandma Esmeralda's little cafe, Sweet Refuge. Now, 2 black-suited security guards had gently escorted her to the top floor of the most imposing skyscraper in downtown. Excuse me, but who are you? Flora asked, nervously adjusting the floral skirt she had chosen in the morning rush. Nothing about her matched that corporate environment. Her reddish-brown hair was somewhat disheveled from the apron she had hastily removed, and her hands still smelled like cinnamon. The man in front of her was everything she was not. Impeccable. Tailored black suit, dark hair perfectly styled, square jaw that seemed carved from marble, and those eyes, blue as the ocean in a storm, cold as Arctic ice. Richard Morphans, CEO of Morphans Enterprises. His voice had that tone that admitted no questions. And apparently your future husband. My what? Flora jumped from the leather chair as if she had been electrocuted. Look here, Mr. Morphine. Morphans. Whatever. I don't know what kind of prank this is, but 15 seconds. Okay, stop with this crazy countdown. Flora slammed both hands on the mahogany table. Explain properly what's happening before I call the police. Richard, or Rick, as she had already decided to call him mentally to annoy him, sighed and pressed a button on the intercom. Miss Montgomery, can you send Mr. Pemberton with the documents? Within seconds, a middle-aged man entered carrying a leather briefcase and the air of someone who would rather be anywhere else. Miss Rosewood, Rick began, his voice maintaining that irritating business tone, your grandmother contracted a considerable debt with our bank. The payment deadline expired yesterday. That's a lie. Grandma Esmeralda never. $250,000. He slid a sheet across the table. Compound interest from 3 years. Your grandmother used the cafe as collateral. Flora felt the world spin. She picked up the paper with trembling hands. There was her grandmother's unmistakable signature, that shaky handwriting she knew so well. She never told me, she whispered. Proud people rarely tell. Rick leaned forward. But I have a proposal that can solve this little problem. Little? $250,000 is little to you? Yes. Just as solving this will be simple for you. He opened the briefcase Pemberton had brought. I need a wife. For 1 year exactly. Did you hit your head? Are you suffering from some mental disorder? Because that would explain a lot. Rick raised an eyebrow, and Flora swore she saw a flash of amusement in those glacial eyes. My grandfather, patriarch of the Morphans family, decided he will only let me take complete control of the company if I get married. He believes it will make me more responsible. And you can't find a real wife because all the women in my social circle want real marriage. Children, country houses, family dinners. He grimaced as if he had tasted something sour. Complicated things. How awful, right? True love must be terrible indeed. This time, Rick definitely almost smiled. You, on the other hand, need $250,000. I need a temporary wife. For 1 year, you pretend to be Mrs. Morphans, attend some social events, smile for photos, and at the end you receive $250,000 clean dollars. Your grandmother keeps the cafe and everyone is happy. And after 1 year, amicable divorce, incompatibility of temperaments. You go back to your life, I go back to mine. Flora looked at the documents, at Rick, at the stunning city view. She thought about Grandma Esmeralda, who had raised her and her younger brother alone after their parents died. She thought about the cafe, the only home she had ever known. I need to think. There's no time. The demolition is scheduled for tomorrow at 7 in the morning. Rick consulted the Swiss watch on his wrist. It's 4:30 in the afternoon. By deciding now, I can still cancel the order today. What kind of person would blackmail someone like this? The kind who inherited an empire at 28 and can't afford to be sentimental. Rick stood up, walked around the table, and stopped right in front of her. So, Flora Rosewood, do you accept being my fake wife? She looked into his eyes and, for a moment, saw something beyond the coldness. A quick, almost imperceptible vulnerability, as if he didn't have much choice either. If I accept, what are the rules? Simple. In public, we're a happy couple. In private, we're business partners. You'll have your own room in my mansion, a generous allowance for clothes and needs, and complete freedom to continue working at the cafe. And you? What do you gain besides deceiving your grandfather? Complete control of Morphin's enterprises, and the guarantee that in 1 year we'll be free from each other. Flora took a deep breath. It was madness. It was impossible. It was... Where do I sign? Rick smiled for the first time since they met. It wasn't a warm smile. It was more like a shark's smile before attack. But there was something about it that made Flora's heart do a small, traitorous somersault. Pemberton, the contracts. As she signed line after line, Flora couldn't stop thinking she was doing the craziest thing of her life, marrying an arrogant and cruel millionaire for money. Grandma Esmeralda was going to have a heart attack. Done. She dropped the pen. When do we start this performance? Tonight. Dinner with my grandfather at 8 sharp. Rick was already typing on his phone. My assistant will take you to choose an appropriate dress. Tonight! But I need to talk to my grandmother, explain. You can make up any story. Lightning romance, love at first sight, whatever you want. He stopped typing and looked at her intently. But one thing, Flora. In front of my family, you love me desperately. Understood? And you? Will you also pretend to love me? Rick hesitated for a fraction of a second. I'll do whatever is necessary. When Flora left that boardroom, being led by Rick's efficient assistant for an afternoon of shopping at stores she didn't even know existed, only one thing hammered in her mind. She had just signed a contract with the devil. A handsome devil, disturbingly charming when he wanted to be, but still. The devil. And the worst part. A part of her, a small, traitorous, and completely irrational part, was curious to discover what it would be like to be loved, even if falsely, by Richard Morphins. God help me, she murmured, as the limousine glided through traffic toward the luxury boutiques district. In the boardroom, Rick observed the city through the panoramic window. There was something about Flora Rosewood that bothered him. The way she had pounded her fist on the table, how she questioned his every word, how her green eyes sparked with anger when he mentioned her grandmother's debt. No woman in his social circle would ever confront him like that. Will it work, sir? Pemberton asked, organizing the documents. Of course it will. Rick adjusted his tie. It's just a business contract. But as he said this, he couldn't forget the way Flora's cinnamon and vanilla perfume had invaded his office, bringing something he hadn't felt in years. Humanity. He shook his head, annoyed with himself. In 1 year, everything would return to normal. She would go back to her cafe, he would assume complete control of the company, and they would go completely opposite ways. It was a perfect plan. So why did he feel like he had just lit a stick of dynamite? This dress costs more than my monthly rent, Flora whispered to her reflection in the boutique's gilded mirror, running her fingers over the midnight blue silk that seemed to flow like liquid starlight around her body. Perfect, declared Vivian Montgomery, Richard's assistant, with the efficiency of someone accustomed to transforming ordinary people into society royalty. Mr. Morphin specifically requested something that would make his grandfather believe in love at first sight. Flora almost choked. Love at first sight? With Mr. Ice King? Your boss has about as much warmth as a frozen fish stick. Vivian's perfectly composed expression cracked just slightly. Perhaps, but frozen fish sticks can be quite surprising when properly Heated. Before Flora could process that oddly suggestive comment, her phone buzzed. Grandma Esmeralda. Flora, darling, where are you? Mrs. Patterson said 2 men in suits came asking about you at the cafe. Grandma, Flora looked at Vivian, who was pretending to examine shoes while obviously listening. I have incredible news. I'm getting married. The silence on the other end was so profound, Flora thought the call had dropped. Married? Flora Rosewood, did you hit your head? To whom? When? And why am I finding out through a phone call while you're apparently shopping for… Wait, where exactly are you? It's complicated. I'll explain everything tonight, I promise. But Grandma, we won't lose the cafe. What cafe? Lose what cafe? Flora Elizabeth Rosewood, you come home right now and… I love you, Grandma. Trust me, okay? Flora hung up and immediately regretted it. In her family, hanging up on Grandma Esmeralda was equivalent to declaring war on a small army. Family complications? Vivian asked sympathetically. You could say that. My grandmother is about to have a nervous breakdown. I'm about to have dinner with a millionaire's family pretending to be madly in love, and I have exactly… She checked her phone. 2 hours to transform into someone worthy of the Morphin's name. Darling, Vivian smiled, and for the first time seemed genuinely human. I've been Richard's assistant for 5 years. I've seen him date models, socialites, heiresses. None of them ever made him change his entire schedule for an emergency shopping trip. What do you mean? He canceled 3 meetings, postponed a conference call with Tokyo, and specifically requested that I find something that matches her personality, not what's expected. Vivian adjusted Flora's hair in the mirror. In 5 years, I've never seen him care about any woman's personality. Flora stared at her reflection. The dress was indeed perfect, elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but still her. But what caught her attention were her own eyes, bright with something she couldn't identify. He's just protecting his investment, she murmured. Vivian didn't seem convinced. Well, his investment is about to meet Theodore Morphin's, and that, my dear, requires tactical preparation. An hour later, Flora sat in the back of Richard's Bentley, trying not to wrinkle her dress or her carefully constructed confidence. He had picked her up punctually at 7:30, and the sight of him in a midnight blue tuxedo that matched her dress exactly had made her momentarily forget how to breathe. Did you coordinate our outfits on purpose? She asked, breaking the tense silence. Vivian has particular attention to detail. Richard adjusted his cufflinks without looking at her. My grandfather notices everything. If we're supposedly madly in love, these details matter. Right, business. Flora smoothed her skirt. So what's your grandfather like? Should I expect another Ice King? Richard was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Theodore Morphin's built this empire from nothing. He came from Ireland with $50 in his pocket and a dream bigger than the Atlantic Ocean. His voice softened slightly. He's the only person in the world I've never been able to disappoint without feeling it here. He touched his chest briefly. Flora studied his profile in the passing streetlight. There was something vulnerable in that confession, something that made her fake fiancé seem suddenly dangerously human. And he wants you married because he believes I've become too much like my father. Cold, calculating, incapable of real connection. Richard finally looked at her. He's not wrong. Oh. Flora felt something twist in her chest. That's sad. It's practical. Emotions complicate everything. Or they make everything worthwhile. He stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. The Morphin's mansion appeared like something from a fairy tale, or a very expensive nightmare. Gothic towers mixed with modern architecture, gardens that seemed designed by someone with severe OCD, and enough security to guard a small country. Flora. Richard turned to her as the car stopped. Whatever happens tonight, remember, we're madly in love. You can't keep your hands off me. I'm completely enchanted by you and we're planning a future together. Got it. Fake love, fake touches, fake future. She took a deep breath. Anything else? Yes. He hesitated. My grandfather has a talent for seeing through lies, so try to find something true in this performance. Before she could ask what that meant, the car door opened. Theodore Morphin's was not what Flora expected. Instead of another cold version of Richard, she found a man in his 70s with twinkling eyes, silver hair, and a smile that could melt icebergs. "So you're the miracle worker," he said, taking Flora's hand and kissing it gallantly. "The woman who finally melted my grandson's frozen heart." "Grandpa," Richard warned. "Oh, hush, boy, I'm talking to your lovely bride-to-be." Theodore offered Flora his arm. "Tell me, my dear, what's your secret? How did you manage to make Richard smile like a human being instead of a corporate robot?" Flora felt Richard tense beside her. This was it, her first test. "Well, Mr. Morphins," she said, linking her arm through Theodore's, "I discovered that underneath all that ice, your grandson has a weakness for cinnamon coffee and someone who's brave enough to call him Rick." Theodore threw his head back and laughed, a sound so joyful it seemed to transform the entire mansion. "Rick? Oh, this is perfect. Nobody has dared call him Rick since he was 12. He patted Flora's hand. "I like you already, dear girl." Behind them, Richard was staring at Flora with an expression she couldn't decipher. But something in his eyes made her stomach do strange things. This was going to be a very long year. Or a dangerously short one, depending on how quickly she lost her heart to a man who claimed not to have one. Dinner at the Morphins' mansion was like navigating a minefield in designer heels. The dining room alone was larger than Flora's entire apartment, with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a table that could seat a small army. "So, Flora," Theodore said, cutting his prime rib with surgical precision, "tell me about yourself. How did you capture my notoriously commitment-phobic grandson?" Flora nearly choked on her wine. Beside her, Richard's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "Well," she began, her mind racing. "It's funny, actually. I spilled coffee all over his expensive suit during our first meeting." This was technically true. She had fantasized about doing exactly that during their contract negotiation. And instead of being furious, she continued, warming to her story, Rick just stood there, dripping with cappuccino, and said it was the most honest thing that had happened to him all week. Theodore's eyes sparkled with delight. "That sounds like my boy. He always did appreciate brutal honesty. Didn't you, Rick?" Richard shot Flora a look that could have frozen hell over. "Something like that." "And when did you know it was love?" Theodore pressed, clearly enjoying himself. This time, Flora looked directly at Richard. Something mischievous sparkled in her green eyes. "When he showed up at my grandmother's cafe at 6 in the morning with a peace offering." "What kind of peace offering?" "A new espresso machine. Top of the line. He said—" Flora paused dramatically. "He said he wanted to make sure I never ran out of ammunition." Theodore burst into laughter. "Oh, this is rich. Richard, you old romantic, you never told me you had such a sense of humor." Richard's jaw could have cracked granite. "Flora has a very creative memory." "I prefer the term imaginative," Flora replied sweetly, taking another sip of wine. The alcohol was definitely helping with her nerves. "And you, Rick?" Theodore turned to his grandson. "When did you know Flora was the one?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Flora watched Richard's face, curious despite herself. For a moment, his corporate mask slipped, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. "When she called me on my bullshit," he said quietly. "No one in my world does that anymore. Everyone just agrees with me because of who I am, what I have. But Flora—" He looked at her, and something in his voice made her heart skip. "Flora treats me like I'm just Rick. Not the CEO, not the heir, not the money. Just me. The sincerity in his voice was so unexpected that Flora felt her breath catch. For a moment, she forgot they were acting. "That's beautiful," Theodore said softly. "Absolutely beautiful." The rest of dinner passed in a blur of stories, laughter, and increasingly sophisticated lies that Flora was amazed she could keep straight. Theodore was charming, witty, and clearly delighted with his grandson's supposed transformation. "Walk with me, my dear," Theodore said to Flora as Richard took a business call that apparently couldn't wait. "I want to show you something." He led her to his study, a room that smelled of leather, whiskey, and old books. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades, Richard as a child, family gatherings, business milestones. "That's Richard at 12. Theodore pointed to a photo of a boy with serious eyes and a hesitant smile. "The day after his parents died." Flora's heart clenched. I didn't know. Car accident. Richard was supposed to be with them, but he had a chess tournament. He's never forgiven himself for being relieved he wasn't in that car." Theodore's voice was gentle but firm. "He built walls after that. Decided emotions were dangerous, unpredictable things that could destroy you. Mr. Morphins, Theodore, please. And I know, my dear." Flora's blood turned to ice. "Know what? That this engagement is about the inheritance clause." Theodore's eyes twinkled with mischief rather than anger. "I've been in business for 60 years, Flora. I know a strategic alliance when I see one." Flora felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "Are you going to tell him you know?" "That depends." Theodore settled into his leather chair. "Are you planning to break his heart?" What? No. I mean, it's not. We're not." Flora sat down heavily in the chair across from him. "It's complicated. The best love stories usually are." Theodore poured himself a whiskey. "You know, I put that marriage clause in my will specifically hoping it would force Richard to find someone real. Someone who would see past the money and the power. But You called him Rick. Do you know he hasn't let anyone call him that since his parents died? Even I have to call him Richard in public." Flora's mind was reeling. "I don't understand what you're trying to say." "I'm saying, my dear girl, that strategic alliance or not, my grandson looks at you like you hung the moon. And you, despite your protests, light up like a Christmas tree every time he enters the room." "That's ridiculous. We barely know each other." "Love doesn't follow timetables, Flora. Sometimes it hits like lightning." Theodore smiled. "Other times it grows slowly, disguised as something else entirely." Before Flora could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right here?" "Perfect," Theodore said, rising. "I was just telling Flora how happy I am that you found each other." The ride home was tense and silent. Flora stared out the window, Theodore's words echoing in her mind. When they pulled up to Richard's mansion, a modern fortress of glass and steel that somehow felt cold despite its architectural beauty, she finally spoke. "Your grandfather knows." Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Knows what?" "About the contract, the inheritance clause, all of it." "That's impossible." "He told me himself. He also said—" Flora hesitated. "He said you haven't let anyone call you Rick since your parents died." Richard was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He told you about the accident?" "Yes." "And you're still here?" Flora turned to look at him. In the dim light of the car, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "Did you think I'd run away?" "Most people do, when they realize how much damage I carry around." Without thinking, Flora reached over and touched his hand. "I'm not most people, Rick." The moment their skin touched, something electric passed between them. Richard stared down at their joined hands like he'd never seen anything so fascinating. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "What is?" "This. You. The way you make me forget that this is just business." Flora's heart hammered against her ribs. Maybe forgetting isn't always a bad thing. Richard looked up at her then, and the intensity in his blue eyes nearly undid her. Flora. Yes? We should go inside, before I do something that complicates everything. But neither of them moved. They sat there, hands touching, hearts racing, both afraid to break the spell that had somehow woven itself around them. Outside, the moon cast silver light over the mansion's gardens. Inside the car, two people who had started as strangers were discovering that some contracts are written by the heart, not on paper. Flora's new room in the Morphins' mansion could have housed a small family, complete with a walk-in closet larger than her previous bedroom, a marble bathroom that belonged in a luxury spa, and a view of the gardens that looked like something from a romance novel. It was beautiful, elegant, and absolutely terrifying. The Wi-Fi password is Theodore 1952, Richard said from the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Breakfast is served from 6 to 9. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, will take care of anything you need. Right. Business arrangements. Flora set her single duffel bag on the enormous bed. It looked pathetically small against the silk duvet. What about the marital appearances? Do we have schedules for fake affection? Something flickered across Richard's face. There's a charity gala next Friday, the Autumn Foundation benefit. We'll need to make our first public appearance as an engaged couple. Sounds terrifying. It will be. He paused at the threshold. Flora, about tonight. What happened in the car? Nothing happened in the car. Flora busied herself unpacking, not trusting herself to look at him. Just two business partners discussing contract terms. Right, contract terms. But he didn't leave. Flora could feel him watching her as she hung up her 3 dresses in the cavernous closet. Why are you still here? She asked without turning around. You have 3 dresses. Brilliant observation. For a year-long engagement to a billionaire. Flora finally faced him. Not all of us have unlimited shopping budgets, Rick. Some of us work at family cafes and consider goodwill a luxury shopping experience. Instead of the dismissive look she expected, Richard's expression softened. Tomorrow, Vivian will take you shopping. For real this time. Everything you need. I don't want your charity. It's not charity, it's... He ran a hand through his dark hair, messing up the perfect styling. You can't show up to million-dollar galas in second-hand dresses. People will talk. Let them talk. Flora. His voice carried a warning. This only works if it's believable. If you look like you belong in my world. Maybe that's the problem. Flora sat on the edge of the massive bed. Maybe I don't belong in your world. Maybe this whole thing is a mistake. Richard crossed the room in 3 quick strides and sat beside her. The mattress dipped under his weight, and suddenly they were close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something expensive and intoxicatingly masculine. Hey, he said softly, look at me. Against her better judgment, she did. Those blue eyes were gentle now, concerned. Tonight, at dinner, you were perfect. You made my grandfather laugh more than I've seen in years. You made him believe that someone could actually... He stopped, swallowed hard. That someone could actually care about me. Rick, don't give up on this. On us. The arrangement, he corrected quickly. Flora studied his face. What aren't you telling me about this inheritance clause? Richard was quiet for a long moment. If I don't marry within 6 months, control of the company goes to my cousin Marcus. And that's bad because Marcus would destroy everything my grandfather built. He'd sell off the profitable divisions, fire half the employees, and turn Morphins Enterprises into a quick cash grab. Richard's jaw tightened. 12,000 people would lose their jobs. Oh. Flora felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. That's a lot of people depending on us. Yes. And you can't just find a real wife because... Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because real wives want real husbands. They want love, emotional availability, someone who can promise them forever. He looked at her directly. I can't promise those things. Why not? Because everyone I've ever loved has left. My parents, my college girlfriend who decided money wasn't worth dating an emotional glacier. My best friend who got tired of competing with my work schedule. His voice was matter of fact, like he was reading a grocery list. I'm not built for love, Flora. But I am very good at business arrangements. Flora felt her heart crack a little. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It's practical. It's heartbreaking. Before Richard could respond, Flora's phone buzzed with a text from her brother Jake. Grandma called. She's planning your wedding for next month and buying a dress. What the hell is going on? Family emergency? Richard asked, reading her expression. You could say that. Flora showed him the message. I may have underestimated my grandmother's enthusiasm for wedding planning. We'll handle it. Tomorrow, after shopping, we'll visit your grandmother. Together, as a couple. Richard stood up. It's time to meet the family. Flora groaned. You have no idea what you're agreeing to. Grandma Esmeralda is intense. She'll interrogate you like you're applying for the FBI. And my brother Jake is worse. He's protective and suspicious of anyone who even looks at me wrong. I can handle it. Can you handle being asked about your intentions, your income, your family medical history, your credit score, and probably your blood type? Richard almost smiled. Is that all? She'll also want to feed you until you explode, show you embarrassing baby pictures of me, and probably ask when we're planning to give her great-grandchildren. This time, Richard did smile, a real one that transformed his entire face. Flora? Yeah? I think I'm going to like your grandmother. After Richard left, Flora lay on the enormous bed staring at the ceiling. Everything about this situation was insane. She was fake engaged to a man who claimed to be emotionally unavailable, but looked at her like she was the answer to questions he didn't know he was asking. Her phone rang. Grandma Esmeralda. Flora Elizabeth, you have exactly 5 minutes to explain to me why Mrs. Patterson saw a limousine drop you off at the cafe this afternoon, and why you're apparently engaged to someone I've never met. Grandma, I can explain. 5 minutes, dear. Starting now. Flora took a deep breath. His name is Richard Morphans. He's wealthy, very wealthy, and he's wonderful to me. This was technically true. He was being wonderful in his own complicated, emotionally constipated way. How long have you known him? Not long, Flora admitted, but sometimes you just know you know. Grandma Esmeralda's tone suggested she didn't know at all. And he proposed how? Flora's mind raced. It was romantic, very romantic. Details, Flora. He said he couldn't imagine his life without me in it. Again, technically true. He literally couldn't complete his business arrangement without her. And you said yes because he's saving our cafe and I'm apparently losing my mind. Because I love him, Grandma. I really do. The words came out before Flora could stop them. And the terrifying thing was, as she said them, they didn't feel entirely like a lie. Well then, Grandma Esmeralda said, her voice warming considerably. I suppose I'll have to meet this young man of yours. After hanging up, Flora stared at her reflection in the room's massive mirror. Somewhere between agreeing to a business arrangement and now, the lines had started to blur. And that, she realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. You bought her a new espresso machine? Jake Rosewood stared at Richard like he'd grown a second head. Dude, my sister spilled coffee on you, and you bought her a $10,000 espresso machine? Flora wanted to disappear into the cafe floor. This was going even worse than she'd anticipated. Richard sat at the small corner table, looking impossibly elegant and completely out of place surrounded by mismatched chairs and homemade decorations. He'd arrived in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, an obvious attempt to look normal that somehow made him look even more expensive. It seemed appropriate, Richard replied carefully, accepting another slice of Grandma Esmeralda's famous apple pie. Flora mentioned the old one was temperamental. Temperamental? Jake snorted. That's one way to put it. Thing was held together with duct tape and prayers. Jacob, Grandma Esmeralda warned from behind the counter, where she was supposedly organizing inventory, but obviously eavesdropping on every word. Be nice to Flora's young man. I'm being nice. I'm just trying to figure out why a billionaire CEO would randomly show up at our cafe and fall in love with my disaster of a sister. Hey, Flora protested, I'm not a disaster. Flo, you once got lost in our own neighborhood. You set the kitchen on fire making toast. You cried watching a commercial about toilet paper. It was a very emotional commercial, Flora muttered, her cheeks burning. Richard was watching this exchange with something that might have been amusement. I find Flora's unique perspective refreshing. Unique perspective, Jake repeated slowly. Is that rich person speak for charmingly chaotic? Jake, Grandma Esmeralda appeared beside their table with the speed of someone half her age. Apologize this instant. It's fine, Mrs. Rosewood, Richard said, standing politely as she approached. Jake is being protective. I respect that. Grandma Esmeralda studied Richard with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Flora held her breath. Sit down, young man. You're making me feel ancient. Grandma Esmeralda pulled up a chair. Now, Richard. May I call you Richard? Of course. Tell me about your intentions with my granddaughter. Flora nearly choked on her coffee. Grandma, we don't need to… Hush, dear. The adults are talking. Grandma Esmeralda never took her eyes off Richard. Well? Richard set down his fork and looked directly at her. I intend to marry Flora, Mrs. Rosewood. I intend to take care of her, protect her, and make sure she never wants for anything. And love her? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Flora watched Richard's face, saw the slight tightening around his eyes. I will do everything in my power to make Flora happy, he said finally. It wasn't exactly an answer, but something in his tone made Flora's heart skip. Grandma Esmeralda leaned back. And what about children? Grandma! Flora's voice cracked with mortification. Flora wants children eventually, Richard said, glancing at her with an unreadable expression. We'll see what the future holds. Good answer. Grandma Esmeralda stood up. Jake, come help me in the kitchen. I want to talk to you. But I want to stay and interrogate. Kitchen. Now. Jake shot Richard one last suspicious look before following their grandmother. The moment they were alone, Flora buried her face in her hands. I'm so sorry. They're a lot. They love you, Richard said simply. Your brother would probably punch me if he thought I'd hurt you. Your grandmother just wants to make sure you're happy. It's nice. Flora looked up at him. Nice? I don't have that. Family who cares enough to interrogate my choices. Richard traced patterns on the wooden table. My grandfather loves me, but he's the only one. And he's more concerned with the business legacy than my personal happiness. That's not true. He wants you to be happy. That's why he has the marriage clause. The marriage clause is about control and tradition. Morphin's men marry young, have heirs, continue the dynasty. Richard's smile was bitter. Happiness is optional. Flora reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Not with me, it isn't. Their eyes met and held. For a moment, the cafe around them seemed to fade away. There was something building between them, something that had nothing to do with contracts or business arrangements. Flora, Richard said quietly, I need to tell you something. Well. They sprang apart as Jake returned, carrying a tray of fresh coffee. Behind him, Grandma Esmeralda wore a satisfied smile that made Flora nervous. Everything okay? Flora asked. Perfect, Jake said, but his tone suggested otherwise. Rick, can I call you Rick? Grandma wants to show you something. Richard glanced at Flora, who shrugged helplessly. Sure. Grandma Esmeralda led them to the wall behind the counter, covered with photos spanning decades, family celebrations, cafe milestones, community events. "This is Flora at 5, she said, pointing to a picture of a gap-toothed little girl covered in flour. "She was trying to help me bake cookies for the church fundraiser." "Grandma, please don't." "And this is Flora at 16, after she organized a food drive that fed 50 families during the holidays." Grandma Esmeralda's voice grew warm with pride. "She worked 3 jobs that summer to pay for it." Richard studied the photo intently. "She looks determined. She's always been a fighter. When her parents died, Flora was only 19. She could have taken the insurance money and gone to college anywhere in the country. Instead, she stayed here to help me run the cafe and raise Jake." Flora felt tears threaten. "Grandma, my granddaughter has the biggest heart of anyone I know, Richard. She sees the best in people, even when they can't see it themselves." Grandma Esmeralda looked directly at him. "She deserves someone who sees how extraordinary she is." The weight of that statement settled over them. Richard was staring at Flora with an expression she couldn't read. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm beginning to understand just how extraordinary she is." An hour later, they sat in Richard's car outside the cafe. The visit had gone better than Flora expected, but she felt emotionally drained. "They like you," she said finally. "Your grandmother is terrifying in the best possible way, and your brother only threatened to kill me twice. That's practically a warm welcome from Jake." Flora smiled. "You handled the interrogation well." "Flora." Richard turned to face her. "What your grandmother said about you staying to take care of your family instead of going to college. It wasn't a sacrifice. Family takes care of family. But you gave up your dreams." Flora was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. But I found new ones. The cafe, helping the community, taking care of the people I love." She looked at him. "What about you? What did you dream about before you became the Ice King CEO?" Richard laughed softly. "Architecture, believe it or not. I wanted to design buildings that would last centuries, structures that would make people feel something. What happened? Reality, responsibility. The company needed me more than the world needed another architect." He started the engine. "Besides, buildings are just another kind of contract. Stone and steel instead of paper and ink." As they drove back to the mansion, Flora found herself thinking about dreams deferred and the different kinds of sacrifices people make. Richard had given up his creative ambitions for duty. She'd given up college for family. Maybe they weren't so different after all. "Richard?" she said as they pulled into his driveway. "Yeah? For what it's worth, I think you would have designed beautiful buildings." He looked at her for a long moment. "For what it's worth, I think you would have changed the world at whatever college you chose." Something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, connection, the recognition of kindred spirits who'd both chosen duty over desire. And Flora realized with growing alarm that she was falling for Richard Morphins. Not his money, not his power, but the man underneath who still dreamed of creating something beautiful and lasting. This fake engagement was becoming dangerously real. The Autumn Foundation Gala was everything Flora had nightmared it would be. Crystal chandeliers that cost more than houses, women dripping in diamonds who spoke in hushed tones about their latest charity projects, and men in tuxedos who discussed million-dollar business deals like casual weather observations. "Breathe," Richard murmured in her ear as they approached the reception line. His hand rested on the small of her back, warm and reassuring through the silk of her emerald dress. "You look stunning, by the way." Flora had to admit, Vivian had outdone herself. The dress was a masterpiece, elegant without being flashy, expensive without being ostentatious. She felt like herself, just elevated. "Easy for you to say," Flora whispered back. "You were born for this. I feel like an imposter in designer clothing." "We're all imposters here, sweetheart. The difference is most of these people are pretending to be better than they are. You're pretending to be less than you are." The endearment made her stomach flutter, even though she knew it was for show. "Mr. Morphins," a silver-haired woman in burgundy velvet swept toward them. "How wonderful to see you, and this must be the mysterious fiancé we've all been dying to meet. Mrs. Ashworth, allow me to introduce Flora Rosewood." Richard's voice carried just the right note of pride and affection. "Flora, this is Catherine Ashworth, president of the foundation." "Pleasure to meet you," Flora said, extending her hand. "Oh my." Mrs. Ashworth grasped Flora's hand between both of hers. "Richard, she's absolutely lovely. And that dress. Vivian has exquisite taste." "Actually," Flora said, "I chose this one myself. Vivian just pointed me toward the right boutique." Mrs. Ashworth's eyebrows rose slightly. "How refreshing. Most young women in your position would simply let their stylists decide everything." "Flora has very definite opinions about most things," Richard said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "It's one of the things I love most about her." The way he said it made Flora's heart skip. For a moment, she almost believed he meant it. The evening continued in a blur of introductions, small talk, and carefully choreographed affection. Richard was the perfect fiancé, attentive without being possessive, proud without being smug. He introduced her to everyone as if she were the most important person in the room. "You're very good at this," Flora said during a quiet moment when they'd stepped onto the terrace for air. "At what?" "Acting like you're madly in love with me." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights. "Flora, I need to tell you something." "What?" Before he could answer, a voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Well, well. Richard Morphins, slumming it with the help." They turned to see a tall, sharp-faced man in an impeccable tuxedo approaching with a blonde woman who looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. "Marcus?" Richard's voice went arctic. "I didn't know you were in town. Wouldn't miss the social event of the season, especially when I heard my dear cousin had gotten himself engaged to—" Marcus looked Flora up and down dismissively. "What was it again?" "A barista." "Watch yourself." Richard stepped slightly in front of Flora, his body language shifting to something predatory. "Oh, come now, Richard. We're all adults here." Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm simply wondering what a cafe worker could possibly offer a man of your refined tastes." Flora felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Richard's voice cut through the tension. "She offers something you wouldn't understand, Marcus. Authenticity." "How quaint." The blonde woman spoke for the first time, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm Celeste Whitmore, Marcus's fiancée. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Flora Rosewood," Flora replied, lifting her chin. "And you're right. We haven't been introduced. I don't usually socialize with people who think their net worth determines their human worth." Marcus's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Flora stepped forward, her fear transforming into anger. "You walked over here to what? Make me feel small? Remind me I don't belong? Well, congratulations. Mission accomplished. But here's the thing about people like me. We don't stay down." "Flora," Richard warned quietly. "No. Let me finish." Flora turned to face Marcus fully. "I may work in a cafe, but I've never had to buy my way into someone's good graces. I've never had to tear someone else down to feel better about myself. And I've certainly never been so insecure about my own worth that I needed to attack a stranger at a charity gala." The terrace had gone dead silent. Flora could see other guests, beginning to notice the confrontation. "You little—" Marcus started forward, but Richard stepped between them. "That's enough." Richard's voice carried enough menace to stop a charging bull. "Marcus, you and your companion need to leave, now. You can't order me around, cousin. I have as much right to be here as you do." "Actually, you don't." Mrs. Ashworth appeared beside them, her expression glacial. "Mr. Whitmore, your behavior tonight has been absolutely appalling. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "You can't be serious." "Deadly serious. Security will escort you out if necessary." As Marcus and Celeste were led away, Flora realized she was shaking. The adrenaline of the confrontation was wearing off, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. "Flora." Richard turned to her, his face full of concern. "Are you all right?" I need a moment." Flora pushed past him toward the ballroom doors. "Excuse me." She made it to the ladies' lounge before the tears started. Sitting on the velvet bench in front of the ornate mirror, Flora finally let herself fall apart. Marcus had hit every insecurity she'd been fighting since this whole arrangement began. "There you are." Flora looked up to see Mrs. Ashworth entering the lounge. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm so sorry about the scene." "Sorry?" The older woman sat beside her. "My dear, you have nothing to apologize for. Marcus Whitmore is a vile creature who's been terrorizing charity events for years. But I shouldn't have lost my temper. You defended yourself with dignity and class, more than he deserved." "Mrs." Ashworth handed Flora a tissue. "Richard is beside himself, you know. He's been pacing the terrace like a caged tiger. He's probably embarrassed. I'm sure this isn't the kind of attention he wanted tonight. On the contrary, I've known Richard since he was a boy, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Flora wiped her eyes. "It's complicated. The best love stories usually are." Mrs. Ashworth smiled. "Take some advice from an old woman who's been married for 47 years. When a man is willing to risk a public confrontation to defend your honor, that's not just good manners, that's love." When Flora returned to the ballroom, she found Richard waiting by the doors. The moment he saw her, relief flooded his features. "Flora, I am so sorry. I should have shut him down the moment he opened his mouth." "You did shut him down. Eventually. Not soon enough." Richard cupped her face gently. "Are you okay?" "I am now." For a moment, they stood there in the middle of the elegant ballroom, and Flora forgot they were surrounded by hundreds of people. All she could see were Richard's blue eyes, full of concern, and something else she was afraid to name. "Dance with me," he said softly. "Richard, please, let me end this night on a better note." He led her onto the dance floor, and as the orchestra played, Flora felt herself melting into his arms. This was dangerous territory. Dancing with Richard felt too real, too right. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For defending me. For making me feel like I belong here." Richard's arms tightened around her. "You do belong here, Flora. You belong wherever you choose to be." As they swayed to the music, Flora realized that somewhere between the contract signing and tonight, everything had changed. This wasn't fake anymore. The way Richard held her, looked at her, protected her, it was real. And that terrified her more than any confrontation with Marcus ever could. Because in a few months, when the year was up, she was going to have to walk away from the only man she'd ever truly loved. 3 months into their arrangement, Flora had developed an unhealthy obsession with watching Richard work. She told herself it was innocent curiosity. After all, she'd never seen a billionaire CEO in his natural habitat. But the truth was more dangerous. She was fascinated by the man behind the corporate mask. "You're staring again," Richard said without looking up from his laptop. They were in his home office, Flora supposedly reading while he handled urgent emails. Instead, she'd been watching him for the past 20 minutes, mesmerized by the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated. "I'm not staring, I'm observing." "Is there a difference?" "Staring is rude. Observing is scientific." Richard finally looked up, and that almost smile played at his lips. "And what exactly are you observing, Dr. Rosewood?" "The way you run your hand through your hair when you're frustrated. You've done it 12 times in the last hour." Flora closed her book. "Also, you always touch your left cufflink when you're about to make a difficult decision." Richard glanced down at his hand, which was indeed near his left cufflink. "That's oddly specific." "I notice things." Flora stood up and moved to the window. The gardens were beautiful in the late afternoon light, but they felt like a golden cage. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever regret this? The arrangement, I mean?" The typing stopped. Flora heard his chair creak as he leaned back. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I catch you looking at me like—" Flora struggled for the words. "Like you wish things were different." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. "Flora, turn around." When she did, Richard was standing, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." Before he could continue, his phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. "Don't answer it," Flora said quickly. "I have to. He's been calling all day." Richard swiped to answer. "What do you want, Marcus?" Flora couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Richard's face grow increasingly thunderous. "Absolutely not," Richard said finally. "The answer is no, and it will always be no. Because she's not part of this. You stay away from her, Marcus. I'm warning you." He hung up and immediately started pacing. "What did he want?" Flora asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "He's found out about the cafe debt. Somehow he discovered that our marriage is connected to your grandmother's financial situation." Flora's blood turned cold. "How is that possible? Marcus has connections everywhere. He's probably been digging into our relationship since the gala." Richard's jaw was tight with fury. "He's threatening to expose everything unless I step aside and let him inherit the company." "Can he do that? Legally?" "If he can prove our marriage is fraudulent, yes. The inheritance clause specifically states that I must be in a legitimate marriage." Flora sank into the nearest chair. "So what do? We stick to the plan. In 3 more months we'll have satisfied the clause, and Marcus will have no power to challenge anything." 3 more months. Flora's voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "Right. The plan." Richard stopped pacing and looked at her intently. "Flora, what I was trying to tell you before. Mr. Morphins? Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a young woman here to see Miss Flora. Says she's her cousin." Flora frowned. "I don't have a cousin. What does she look like?" "Blonde, very fashionable, quite insistent." Flora and Richard exchanged glances. "Celeste," they said simultaneously. They found Celeste in the main foyer, examining a priceless vase with the air of someone calculating its worth. "Celeste." Richard's voice could have frozen fire. "What are you doing in my home?" "Hello, darling." Celeste turned with a predatory smile. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I simply had to speak with your lovely fiancé. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of me." Richard moved protectively closer to Flora. "Oh, how gallant. But this is girl talk, really." Celeste's eyes glittered with malice. "I thought Flora should know what she's gotten herself into." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Flora asked, finding her voice. "Marcus has been doing some digging into your charming little love story. Did you know, for instance, that Richard here was engaged before? To my dear friend Sophia Blackwell?" Flora felt the world tilt slightly. Richard had never mentioned a previous engagement. "That was a long time ago," Richard said tightly. 2 years ago, actually. Sophia was devastated when you called off the engagement. Said you told her you were incapable of love. That marriage was just a business transaction to you." Celeste's smile widened. "Sound familiar?" "That's enough." Richard stepped forward, but Celeste wasn't finished. "The poor girl was so heartbroken she moved to Paris, but not before she told me all about your fascinating views on love and commitment." Celeste turned to Flora. "Did he use the same lines on you, darling? The whole 'I'm not built for love' speech?" Flora felt sick. Everything Celeste was saying aligned perfectly with things Richard had told her. "Get out," Richard's voice was deadly quiet. "Now." "Oh, I'm going. But Flora, dear, do ask Richard about the prenup he had Sophia sign. particularly the clause about what happens if she ever fell in love with him for real. Celeste headed for the door, then paused. Spoiler alert, she loses everything and gets nothing. The front door closed behind Celeste with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the suddenly silent foyer. Flora, Richard began, but she held up a hand. Is it true? About Sophia? Richard's silence was answer enough. The prenup she mentioned is nothing like our arrangement, Richard said quickly. Flora, you have to understand. Do I? Because from where I'm standing it sounds like you have a pattern. Find a woman, make her fall for you, then crush her when she gets too close. That's not what happened with Sophia. Then what did happen? Richard ran both hands through his hair. She said she loved me. Real love, not the arrangement we'd agreed to, and I panicked. So you threw her away. I ended it before it could get more complicated, before I could hurt her more than I already had. Flora stared at him, pieces clicking into place. You're going to do the same thing to me, aren't you? When the year is up, when you have your inheritance secured, you're going to walk away without looking back. Flora, it's not that simple. It is that simple, Flora's voice cracked. You told me from the beginning that this was business. I'm the idiot who started believing it could be something more. You're not an idiot, and this isn't what? Real? Flora laughed bitterly. You're right. It's not real. It's just another business transaction for you, and I'm just another Sophia. Don't say that. Why not? It's true, isn't it? Flora was backing toward the stairs, desperate to escape before she completely fell apart. I'm exactly what Celeste said. Another woman foolish enough to fall for Richard Morphins's act. Flora, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain. I understand perfectly. Flora paused at the bottom of the stairs. You made it very clear from the beginning what this was. I'm the one who forgot the terms of our contract. She ran upstairs before Richard could respond, leaving him standing alone in the foyer with the echoes of her words ringing in the air. In her room, Flora pressed her back against the closed door and finally let the tears fall. She'd been such a fool. Thinking that the gentle touches, the protective gestures, the way he looked at her, meant something real. Richard Morphins was exactly what he'd always claimed to be, a man incapable of love. And she'd been stupid enough to fall for him anyway. Outside her door, she could hear Richard pacing in the hallway, occasionally stopping as if he might knock. But he never did. And that, Flora thought, told her everything she needed to know about where she really stood in his carefully ordered world. The contract had 3 months left. 3 months to guard her heart and prepare for the inevitable goodbye. She just wasn't sure her heart would survive the wait. The next 2 weeks passed in a careful dance of avoidance. Flora threw herself into work at the cafe, staying late to avoid returning to the mansion until she was sure Richard would be asleep. He, in turn, seemed to spend every waking hour at the office or traveling for business. They were like ghosts, haunting the same house, never quite occupying the same space. When they did encounter each other, the conversations were painfully polite. Good morning. How was your day? Pass the salt, please. Each interaction felt like walking on broken glass. Flora was reorganizing the cafe's inventory on a rainy Thursday morning when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see Theodore Morphins, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. Mr. Morphins! Flora rushed from behind the counter. What are you doing here? Ah, my dear girl. Call me Theodore, remember? He settled into a corner booth with a weary sigh. I was hoping we could have a chat. Preferably over some of that famous coffee my grandson can't stop talking about. Flora busied herself making his drink, buying time. Richard talks about the coffee? Richard talks about you, constantly. Or rather, he did until recently. Theodore accepted the steaming mug with grateful hands. Now, he mopes around like a bear with a thorn in his paw. I don't know what you mean. Flora, dear, I may be old, but I'm not blind. You two haven't been seen together in public for weeks. Richard looks like he hasn't slept since the Renaissance, and you... He studied her face carefully. You look like your heart is breaking. Flora's composure cracked slightly. It's complicated. Love usually is. Theodore leaned forward. Tell me what happened. Against her better judgment, Flora found herself pouring out the whole story. Celeste's visit, the revelation about Sophia, her growing certainty that she was just another business transaction to Richard. And you believed her? Theodore asked when she finished. Why wouldn't I? Richard never denied having the same pattern. He's made it clear from the beginning that he doesn't do love. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. Flora, has Richard ever told you why his relationship with Sophia really ended? He said she fell in love with him and he panicked. That's partially true. Theodore stirred his coffee thoughtfully. What he didn't tell you is that Sophia's love wasn't for him. It was for his money, his status, the lifestyle he could provide. When she told him she loved him, she immediately followed it with suggestions for a bigger engagement ring, a more expensive wedding, a prenup that would set her up for life, regardless of whether the marriage lasted. Flora felt her world tilt. What? Richard may be many things, but he's not stupid. He realized Sophia had never seen him as anything more than a very lucrative opportunity. Theodore's eyes were sad. It's why he was so convinced he was incapable of real love. Every woman in his life had wanted Richard Morphin's the billionaire, not Rick the man who still dreams about designing buildings. But, Celeste said, Celeste told you exactly what Marcus wanted you to hear. Enough truth to make the lie believable. Theodore reached across the table and patted her hand. My dear, have you considered that you might be the first woman to make Richard question everything he believed about himself? Before Flora could respond, the cafe door burst open. Jake stumbled in, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. Flora, thank God you're here. He spotted Theodore and hesitated. Oh, hi, Mr. Morphins. Hello, Jacob. You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, I've seen Marcus. Jake turned to Flora. He's been at the bank, Flo, asking questions about Grandma's loan, the cafe's finances, everything. Flora's blood ran cold. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's looking for ammunition. The bank manager called to warn us. Marcus has been spreading rumors that your engagement is fake, that the whole thing is some kind of fraud. Theodore's expression darkened. That boy has gone too far. There's more, Jake continued. He's filed some kind of legal challenge. Claims Richard isn't eligible for the inheritance because his marriage is fraudulent. There's going to be a hearing. Flora felt the room spin. When? Next week. Theodore stood up abruptly. I need to make some phone calls. Flora, whatever happened between you and Richard, you need to fix it, and fast. Theodore, I don't think... My dear girl, Marcus isn't just challenging Richard's inheritance. If he succeeds, the first thing he'll do is call in every outstanding debt the company holds, including your grandmother's. The implications hit Flora like a physical blow. He'd foreclose on the cafe. Without hesitation, Marcus has never forgiven this family for choosing Richard over him. He'll destroy everything Richard cares about out of spite. After Theodore left, Flora sat in the empty cafe feeling overwhelmed. Everything was falling apart and it was her fault. If she hadn't let her emotions get involved, if she'd stuck to the business arrangement. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Can we talk, please? Flora stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Meet me at the cafe tonight, after closing. Richard arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there was something desperate in his eyes that made Flora's heart clench. You heard about Marcus, he said without preamble. Yes. Flora, I need you to know something. Whatever happens at that hearing, whatever Marcus does, I will not let him take the cafe from your family. How? If the inheritance clause fails, then I'll buy the debt myself. With my personal funds, the cafe will be safe regardless. Flora stared at him. You'd do that? Of course I would. Richard stepped closer. Flora, these past 2 weeks have been hell. I can't eat, can't sleep, can't think about anything except how badly I've screwed this up. Richard, please let me finish. You asked me about Sophia, and I told you the truth, but not the whole truth. Richard's voice was raw with emotion. Sophia never loved me. She loved what I could give her. When she said those words, all I could think was, here we go again. Another woman who sees dollar signs instead of a person. And with me. With you, everything is different. Richard's blue eyes were intense, vulnerable. You fight with me, challenge me, call me on my bullshit. You make me want to be a better man, not just a richer one. Flora's heart was hammering. Richard, I love you, Flora. Not the idea of you, not what you represent for my inheritance, but you. The woman who spills coffee and reorganizes my entire world. The woman who makes me remember what it feels like to be human. The words hung in the air between them, everything Flora had dreamed of hearing, and everything she was terrified to believe. How do I know this isn't just about the hearing, about needing me to play the part a little longer? Richard pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box, but instead of opening it, he set it on the table between them. Because I bought this 3 months ago, long before Marcus became a threat. I've been carrying it around like a lovesick fool, waiting for the courage to give it to you properly. Flora stared at the box, her heart in her throat. I don't want a fake marriage, Flora. I want a real one. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to build something beautiful with you, something that lasts. Richard knelt down beside her chair, his voice breaking slightly. Flora Rosewood, will you marry me? For real this time. Not for contracts or inheritances or business arrangements, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible. Flora looked into his eyes and saw everything she'd been afraid to hope for. Love, vulnerability, a future that wasn't bounded by contracts or time limits. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes. As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds that caught the cafe's warm light perfectly, Flora realized that sometimes the best love stories start with the worst ideas. Outside, the rain had stopped, and through the cafe windows, the first stars were beginning to appear. Inside, 2 people who had started as strangers were beginning their real love story, one that no contract could define and no amount of money could buy. 2 years later, the grand opening of Sweet Refuge downtown was everything Flora had dreamed it would be, and nothing like she'd originally planned. The gleaming new location stood in the heart of the business district, with floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed brick walls, and enough seating for twice their original capacity. But what made Flora's heart sing wasn't the modern espresso machines or the designer furniture. It was watching Grandma Esmeralda hold court at the corner table, regaling a captivated audience of executives with stories from the old neighborhood. Mrs. Rosewood, this apple pie is incredible, declared Catherine Ashworth, who had become one of their most devoted regulars. You simply must give me the recipe. Oh, honey, Grandma Esmeralda winked. That recipe is a family secret. But I might consider sharing it, for the right price. Flora smiled as she watched the negotiation unfold. Her grandmother had taken to the business world like a duck to water, charming everyone from junior analysts to board members with her combination of old-world wisdom and sharp wit. Your grandmother is terrifying in the best possible way, a familiar voice said behind her. Flora turned to find Richard approaching with 2 coffee cups, and that smile that still made her stomach flutter, even after 2 years of marriage. Real marriage this time, with real vows spoken in front of their families and friends. She's been talking about expanding into catering, Flora said, accepting her cup. I think she has her sights set on corporate takeover through baked goods. Honestly, I'd bet on her over most CEOs I know. They stood together watching the bustling cafe. The legal battle with Marcus had been swift and decisive, once Theodore presented evidence of Marcus's fraudulent claims and attempted blackmail. Marcus had been quietly removed from any position of influence in the family business, while Celeste had mysteriously disappeared back to whatever social climbing circle she'd emerged from. Speaking of CEOs, Flora nudged Richard's shoulder. How did the Henderson Project meeting go? Richard's face lit up in a way that never failed to warm Flora's heart. 6 months ago, he'd shocked everyone by stepping back from day-to-day operations at Morphin's Enterprises to pursue his abandoned dream of architecture. Theodore had been initially skeptical until Richard presented his first proposal, a series of affordable housing developments that would be both beautiful and sustainable. They approved the design, Richard said, barely containing his excitement. All 46 units plus the community center and green spaces. Rick! Flora threw her arms around him, not caring that half the cafe was watching. That's incredible. It gets better. They want me to lead the entire redevelopment project for the East Side. 20 buildings, Flora. 20 buildings that could house over 300 families. Flora pulled back to look at his face. The transformation in Richard over the past 2 years had been remarkable. Gone was the cold, calculating businessman who'd first propositioned her. In his place was a man who smiled freely, laughed often, and talked about his work with a passion that made him glow from the inside out. I'm so proud of you, she said softly. Hey, none of this would have happened without you. Richard cupped her face gently. You made me remember that buildings aren't just about steel and stone. They're about creating homes, communities, places where people can build their lives. Before Flora could respond, a small hurricane in the form of Jake burst through the cafe doors. Flora, Rick, you'll never guess what just happened. Jake was practically vibrating with excitement as he approached, still wearing his chef's whites from the Culinary Institute. Let me guess, Flora said, grinning at her brother's enthusiasm. You finally perfected that soufflé recipe you've been working on? Better. Remember that restaurant review show I auditioned for? They called. I got it. Jake picked Flora up and spun her around. I'm going to be the youngest correspondent they've ever had. Jake, that's amazing. Flora hugged him tightly. Watching her baby brother pursue his dreams with such determination had been one of the unexpected joys of the past 2 years. Congratulations, man, Richard said, shaking Jake's hand warmly. The relationship between the two men had evolved from suspicious tolerance to genuine friendship, much to Flora's delight. This calls for celebration, Grandma Esmeralda declared, appearing beside them with the speed that had impressed cafe patrons for decades. Jake, dear, go get that bottle of champagne from my office. The good stuff. As Jake hurried off, Theodore appeared at Grandma Esmeralda's side. The unlikely friendship that had developed between Richard's grandfather and Flora's grandmother had been a source of endless entertainment for their families. Champagne at 3 in the afternoon, Esmeralda? What will the neighbors think? Theodore Morphin's at my age, I'll drink champagne whenever I damn well please, Grandma Esmeralda replied with a twinkle in her eye. Besides, we're celebrating. My grandson is going to be on television. Well, in that case, I suppose we'll have to make an exception. Theodore's smile was fond as he looked at the assembled group. Though I do hope you'll save some for the real celebration tonight. Flora and Richard exchanged glances. They'd managed to keep their news secret for exactly 3 days. A personal record. What celebration? Flora asked innocently. Oh, please. Theodore rolled his eyes. Richard's been walking around with that same dopey smile he had when he was planning to propose. And you, my dear Flora, have been glowing like a lighthouse. When exactly were you planning to tell us about the baby? Flora's mouth fell open. How did you... Grandfather's intuition, Theodore said smugly. Plus, you've been ordering decaf for the past week, and Richard has been reading parenting books on his lunch breaks. Parenting books. Grandma Esmeralda's eyes widened. Flora Elizabeth Morphins, are you pregnant? The entire cafe fell silent. Flora felt her cheeks burn as every patron turned to stare at their table. Surprise? Flora said weakly. The resulting cheer from Grandma Esmeralda could probably be heard 3 blocks away. She immediately began announcing the news to every customer in the cafe, while Theodore pumped Richard's hand and muttered something about great-grandbabies and family legacy. "Well," Richard said, wrapping his arms around Flora from behind, "so much for keeping it quiet until the second trimester." "Are you kidding? I'm amazed we made it this long. Your grandfather is basically psychic, and my grandmother has eyes in the back of her head." They watched their family celebrate around them, and Flora marveled at how much their world had expanded. 2 years ago, she'd been a lonely cafe worker worried about paying bills. Now she was surrounded by love, laughter, and the promise of new adventures. "Any regrets?" Richard asked softly, his hand coming to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. Flora thought about it seriously. The past 2 years hadn't been without challenges, learning to blend their very different worlds, navigating the complexities of Richard's business transition, dealing with the occasional society event where she still felt like an imposter. But every difficult moment had been balanced by countless beautiful ones. "Just one," she said finally. Richard tensed slightly. "What?" "I regret that it took us so long to stop pretending and start being real with each other." Richard's laugh was warm and relieved. "Well, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." "The rest of our lives," Flora repeated, tasting the words. "I like the sound of that." As the celebration continued around them, Flora caught sight of their reflection in the cafe window. Richard's arms were wrapped around her, both of their faces bright with happiness, surrounded by family and friends in the space where their love story had truly begun. The fake engagement had lasted exactly 1 year. The real marriage, Flora was determined, would last forever. Outside, snow began to fall on the city streets, transforming the urban landscape into something magical. Inside Sweet Refuge, 2 hearts that had found their home in each other were already planning their next adventure. And if that adventure happened to involve sleepless nights, diaper changes, and a baby who would undoubtedly inherit both Richard's stubborn streak and Flora's ability to charm everyone they met. Well, Flora thought, watching Richard argue with Theodore about proper stroller specifications, while Grandma Esmeralda planned a baby shower that would probably require its own zip code, there was nobody she'd rather face that beautiful chaos with. After all, the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding perfect love. They were about imperfect people choosing to build something perfect together, one day at a time. And Flora Rosewood Morphans, former barista, current cafe co-owner, future mother, and eternal believer in second chances, wouldn't have it any other way. The end.